Good evening. My name is Juan Zabala, and I'm Vice President for University Advancement at Lamar University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you again to the Digital Alumni and Friends Gathering of Lamar University. We decided during this time of pandemic and social distancing that a way to keep our community connected was to have these occasional gatherings of our alumni and friends at which we would feature distinguished alumni of Lamar University. So in June, we started doing this on a monthly basis now that the state and country is opening back up. And so you're extraordinarily fortunate to come to the June presentation of this because we got really, really lucky, and we've been able to convince our distinguished alumna, Ellen Rienstra, to be our speaker this evening. While she was at Lamar, Ellen was a part of the Delta Pi Sorority. She was in the Orchestra, the Wind Ensemble, and the Symphonic Band. Despite this massive music background, her incredible distinguished career has been mostly in history and literature, specifically involving the history of our region. She is a contractor for historical research and writing with the Nelda C. and H.J. Stark Lutcher Foundation. She's a prolific writer, having published many, many pieces. Her works include at least 10 books, journals, plays, and many articles. Her book, Giant Under the Hill, A History of Spindletop Oil Discovery in Beaumont, Texas in 1901, was named the second best book in Texas history by the Texas State Historical Association, and it received the Otis Locke Award for the best book in East Texas history from the East Texas History Association. Her book, A Pride of Kin, was chosen by Texas A&M Press as one of the 3 books it used to launch its Frank Wardlaw series. And her book, The Long Shadows, The Lutcher Stark Dynasty, won an award for merit for leadership in history from the American Association of State and Local History. In 2018, Lamar University named Ellen Distinguished Alumna of Lamar University. She stays very involved with Lamar. She is a past president of the Lamar Advisory Board. She currently serves as the trustee of the Lamar University Foundation, where she chairs our audit committee. She is a member of the Spindletop Gladys City Boomtown Museum Board, and she's a member of the board of the Center for History and Culture of Southeast Texas and the Upper Texas Coast. She established a scholarship in music at Lamar University and has hosted for us a couple of versions of Dinner and 12 Strangers. She's a member of Women in Philanthropy, and she served as chair of our 1962 Lamar University class reunion. Ellen, we're so thrilled to have you with us this evening.
Good evening, Juan. Thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be there, and I hardly knew who you were talking about. Thank you so much for your kind words. I really appreciate them.
But you're far too humble, and we're thrilled to have you, and it's really good to see you. So before we move into the program, give us a little bit of what is a pandemic, what does social distancing in 2020 look like for Ellen Rienstra?
Well, as I was telling you earlier, I've gotten very well acquainted with my house. I haven't been this long uninterruptedly in my house for decades, I guess, and it's really been nice. As I was telling you, it's I'm getting spoiled to putting on sweatshirt and comfortable slacks and not having to put on makeup or anything like that. So I've really enjoyed it. I've had a chance to work. We're working on a centennial book. My sister and I and Brendan Gillis, her assistant. And I've had a chance to work on it some. And so I've enjoyed it.
So, and we're talking about the centennial, of course, of Lamar University, which
yes.
In 2023, we will be a young 100 years old on campus.
Indeed. And it is a fascinating project, to do the research on the history. And, we want to write it up. It's going to be a coffee table book. With lots of pictures and call outs and sidebars and things like that. We hope it's going to be a fun thing for people to have.
Well, and you and your sister, people who don't know, that's Judy Lindsley, right? You and your sister at the helm of this means it's going to be an incredible book, so we can't wait to see it. So you're a writer and a historian, and during a downtime like this, what does somebody with your sort of keen knowledge about many written materials, what have you been reading? What's interesting to Ellen Rienstra on when you got some downtime?
Well, I have so many rabbit trails that I love to follow. I had an uncle who told me one time that he would have to live 175 more years just to get his reading done. And he didn't make it, but I know exactly how he feels. The two books, one I just finished, which is just marvelous. It's by one of my favorite writers, Eric Larson, and it's his newest one, and it's called The Splendid and the Vile. And I just finished it, and it is riveting. It's about Churchill from the first day he took office through that first year. And so then I kind of was on a roll about reading about World War II. So right now I'm reading The Monuments Men, which is another fascinating thing. So, it's wherever these rabbit trails lead us.
The thing I love The Monuments Men. It's such a great story and such an amazing part of our world history. And, we have a faculty member on campus whose research is on these art, the art that was sort of moved from its original location and brought back by the Monuments Men.
Yes.
Fascinating part of our history.
It absolutely is. And one that really wasn't well known, I don't think, until it began to come out, in the last decades. And so anyway, I'm enjoying that book too.
That's excellent. Well, so what we're doing tonight, a little something different. We asked Ellen to do a different type of presentation for us. And so earlier, Ellen recorded for us a program on sort of the history of our region in dealing with crisis moments. And of course, it's been over 100 years, well, it's been 800 years since we've had a global pandemic to deal with, but our region knows, we in this region know about dealing with crisis. So we're going to listen to Ellen talk to us about sort of the resiliency of our region and how we've gotten through it. So do you have any words of introduction before we move to the recorded version?
No, I will say that, anytime you tackle a project like that, you're going to see some things that you never thought about. And I think what struck me about researching this is that the locale, the geography, how inhabitants interact with their environment is so much a part of it. And our response to these crises reflects our environment. And it really was interesting as it unfolded. That's, one of the things that was brought out to me. So I hope I convey that.
All right, well, perfect. Then we'll move on into that part of the program. Daniel, thank you.
Good evening. I hope all of you heard Angela Blanchard's wonderful presentation several weeks ago on disaster response and the importance of community. I'd like to add a little historical perspective on some of the experiences we've had in Southeast Texas and how we've dealt with them. Here, we've had a unique history and a wealth of natural advantages, and we've certainly had more than our share of adversity through the years, as well as phenomenal strokes of good luck. Certainly, this region has shared plenty of disasters with the rest of the country and the world. For instance, the adverse circumstances of the various wars, nations and families sending their children to battle and sacrificing at home. In 1918, in the middle of World War I, in a foreshadowing of the scourge we're dealing with today, the Spanish flu killed millions worldwide and over 600,000 Americans. It eventually made its murderous way to Southeast Texas. In Beaumont, the final count showed 20,000 cases, which was half the population of the town. But thanks to a quick quarantine, only 75 deaths were recorded. In the hardships and privations of the Great Depression, for instance, thousands lost their jobs and property, and many were forced to bread lines and soup kitchens to avoid starvation, including many in Southeast Texas. In the 1940s and 50s, polio terrorized parents worldwide for their children until vaccines were discovered in 1955 and 1961. All these experiences and more we shared with every American and with many with the rest of the world. But every region has its own set of advantages and problems, and our corner of Texas is no exception. My father, historian Johnny Walker, calls Southeast Texas the other Texas. Our region differs radically in climate, terrain, geographical location, culture, and many other ways from the rest of the state. And one major difference, it lies at the conjunction of a wealth of diverse natural resources. The rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, the Big Thicket in the Great East Texas piney woods to the north, and the rich Blackland prairies to the southwest. They're all within easy reach, as our earliest settlers were quick to discover. This area developed first with rice farming and cattle ranching in the 1840s and 50s, and then the great lumber booms in the late 19th century. Then, in the Lucky Break department, on January 10th, 1901, a universal game changer exploded in Southeast Texas when an Austrian mining engineer named Anthony Lucas brought in an oil gusher on Spindletop Hill just south of Beaumont. Literally, from one second to the next, the discovery changed the course of world history. Oil production increased exponentially in Texas and the nation. Stated simply, it was Spindletop that launched the 20th century as the century of oil. And its local impact was enormous. Global giants of the future, Gulf, Texaco, Humble, Sun, all had their beginnings at Spindletop. Gulf and Texaco launched construction of mammoth refineries in Port Arthur, and in 1902, Standard Oil Interests built a huge refinery on the Neches River across the Port Arthur Highway from the future site of Lamar University. It eventually would become ExxonMobil. All these events would ultimately play a major role in the development of our region and Lamar, and eventually, Southeast Texas and the Gulf Coast would host one of the largest refinery and petrochemical complexes in the world. But with these advantages come the drawbacks. Everything comes with a price. And unfortunately, in our region, we've set many grim records. But through the years and sometimes hard and bitter experience, we Southeast Texans have developed remarkable resilience and ingenuity in responding to our particular set of adversities. And with each misfortune, there's always something new and a fresh lesson to be learned. As much of a blessing as it's been to our region, a perennial danger has been, is, and always will be our prime location near the Gulf of Mexico. No surprise here, we're vulnerable to the menace of tropical storms and hurricanes, as we've been reminded of this past week. One of the earliest on record was a rare November storm in 1527, which destroyed a merchant fleet in Galveston. And so it goes year after year, century after century, along the entire Texas coastline. Just a few months after the end of the Civil War, a killer hurricane hit Orange in September, our deadly month, in 1865. The storm caused almost total destruction and considerable loss of life. According to an eyewitness, quote, "There was not a leaf left on a tree or weed, and grass was torn out of the ground by its roots." Hard to imagine how hard the wind was blowing. It took Orange years to recover from the 1-2 punch of the Civil War and the storm, but they did in time for their enormous lumber boom in the last part of the 19th century. In October of 1886, another hurricane hit Sabine Pass, one of the most thriving little cities on the Texas Gulf Coast and on its way to becoming a major seaport, but after the storm, the town declined. As Sabine Pass faded, the city of Galveston grew into the premier port city of the Gulf of the Texas Gulf Coast. But on September 8, 1900, a monster hurricane savaged Galveston with winds of 145 miles per hour. The horrific result was that 6,000 to 12,000 people were killed. The exact number remains unknown because so many were lost without a trace. Most buildings on the island were destroyed. Afterward, Galveston, like Sabine Pass, faded from prominence as a seaport and commercial center because it would always be vulnerable to storms. The Great Storm of 1900, as it became known, is still listed as the worst natural disaster in United States history. If you haven't read Isaac's Storm by Eric Larson, I highly recommend it. It's a blow-by-blow account of Galveston during the 1900 storm. But Galveston shortly made the best of the catastrophe in astounding ways. In 1902, construction began on a curved seawall 17 feet high, built on the east side of the island facing the Gulf. And in 1903, a massive grade raising project was begun by pumping sea bottom sand into the city, raising the level of 500 city blocks on the east end of the island from a few inches to 11 feet. 2,000 buildings were raised on hand crank jack screws. I still can't believe they did it. Galveston also voted in a strong centralized city government to oversee the project and handle economic recovery, and it became a model used by other cities around the country. This massive project paid off in 1915 when another huge hurricane destroyed towns all along the Texas coast and heavily damaged Houston, but Galveston's seawall mitigated much of the damage and loss of life. And Galveston has lately enjoyed a renaissance as a tourist attraction. In 1950, the National Hurricane Center began naming the storms to make it easier to remember them. And in 1957, we in Southeast Texas got a fresh reminder of how terrifying a major hurricane can be when we woke up that morning to hurricane-force winds and torrential rain. Hurricane Audrey, which would rank near the top of the deadliest storms in U.S. history, unexpectedly increased its speed as it moved toward shore, taking meteorologists and residents by surprise. It hit early between the Sabine River and Cameron, Louisiana, killing an estimated 600. A Cameron doctor continued to treat victims even after he learned that several of his family had been killed. Southeast Texas cities suffered widespread wind and water damage, and the name of Audrey was permanently retired from the list of named storms, as would be the names of future major hurricanes. Only 4 years later, in 1961, Southeast Texas braced for another mammoth cyclone. Hurricane Carla was an immense Category 4 storm. Its satellite image covered almost the entire Gulf of Mexico. That was quite a sight. Several of its tornadoes hit Galveston, and one F4 damaged 200 buildings with the strongest winds ever recorded in a hurricane-spawned tornado. After Carla, we earned a 40-year reprieve, and we were lulled, of course, into a false sense of security. Then, as somebody said, those things found out where we live. Tropical Storm Allison, deceptively innocuous, struck Southeast Texas June 4th, 2001, without the fanfare normally given to a full-fledged hurricane. But it stalled, re-entered the Gulf, and came back as a major flood disaster. Houston got the brunt of the storm with over 35 inches of rain, causing catastrophic damage to the medical center and the downtown business and theater district. Allison shook us out of our complacency and gave us a heads up that the storm-free years could end at any time, and that, of course, proved to be the case. Only 4 years later, in September 2005, Hurricane Rita became the first major storm to hit Southeast Texas in over 40 years. Rita was a vicious Category 5 storm and the most intense ever recorded in the Gulf, with a central barometric pressure hitting 897 millibars. It struck Southeast Texas September 24th near Sabine Pass as a high Category 3 with maximum sustained winds of 120 miles an hour. 113 were killed in Texas alone, and over 4,000 homes were destroyed in Orange and Jefferson counties. Offshore rigs and pipelines suffered major destruction. However, extensive measures were put into place before the storm hit. For instance, the Entergy Company deployed 13,000 workers and 4,500 support staff, and the federal government established disaster medical assistance teams in 12 field hospitals across East Texas. A contraflow lane reversal was established on several freeways north out of Houston, and a mass evacuation of 2.5 to 3.5 million was ordered, which led to an epic traffic jam that no one who experienced it will ever forget. 107 fatalities occurred during the evacuation, including residents of a nursing home who tragically died on Interstate 45 when their bus caught fire. When the storm hit, its winds extended over 100 miles inland, and 400,000 acres of Southeast Texas forest were damaged or destroyed. Just as no one will ever forget being in the evacuation traffic jam, so no one who stayed in this area and heard Rita's terrifying winds will ever forget their sound. I did, and I know I won't. Every disaster is different, and each teaches us its own lessons. Barely 3 years later, Southeast Texas faced another mammoth storm, Hurricane Ike, which made landfall on the northeast end of Galveston Island in September of 2008. This time, the prime culprit wasn't the wind, but the water. Ike was such a huge storm that the damage ranged from Corpus Christi into Louisiana, and unluckily, its storm surge coincided with a high tide, which made the flooding worse. The National Weather Service issued a chilling bulletin about the projected storm surge along Galveston Bay's shoreline. If occupants didn't evacuate, they would face, quote, certain death. Some residents chose to ignore the warnings and paid the ultimate price. A quote from a Tyler County emergency management officer applies here, quote, anyone who chooses not to evacuate cannot expect to be rescued and should write their social security number on their arm so their body can be identified. In Galveston, Ike's storm surge topped the seawall and caused widespread flooding. The Bolivar Peninsula was struck by the right front quadrant of the storm, the so-called dirty side. Parts of the peninsula, particularly around Gilchrist and Rollover Pass, were swept clean. The community of Crystal Beach was destroyed, and 80% of the peninsula's houses were lost. Debris from the wrecked houses piled up along the north shores of Galveston Bay. The town of Bridge City was almost completely submerged, and when cleanup got underway, workers found jellyfish living in the swimming pools. 85 deaths occurred in Texas alone, and the post-Ike search and rescue operation was the largest in Texas history. But the Southeast Texas spirit was evident. One organization furnished pizza for Bolivar residents and staged a Bridge City Christmas party. After Ike, Southeast Texas earned a 9-year hall pass, but then came more floods. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey, first dismissed as a tropical storm, doesn't do to take tropical storms too lightly. Harvey crossed the Yucatan Peninsula on September 23rd into the Gulf and became a major hurricane. It stalled for 4 days over the Southeast Texas coast, dumping record amounts of rain with peak accumulation in Nederland of over 60 inches. That's in 4 days. It still stands as the national record, an amount undreamed of in previous decades, but becoming more and more the norm as climate changes. Interstate 10 at Winnie looked like the Gulf of Mexico. There were actually white caps on the water's surface. Houston and Winnie experienced catastrophic flooding with more than a third of the city underwater, and Southeast Texas welcomed with profound gratitude the members of the Cajun Navy, Louisiana volunteer group, who brought boats, airboats, and other rescue equipment, as well as their own extensive knowledge and expertise of operating on the water. Harvey flooded hundreds of thousands of homes, with 17,000 rescues and 103 deaths in Texas. And just as the storm was receding and everybody was breathing a sigh of relief, Beaumont suddenly and unexpectedly lost its water supply. For several days, the city was without water until a good angel in the form of the Crenshaw family diverted a pump shipment from one of their businesses and saved the day. Lamar University established the Cardinal Emergency Fund, which addressed students' needs to enable them to stay in school. For many days, Beaumont remained an island. Interestingly, it was Highway 90, the old Spanish trail, that first opened from Beaumont west to Houston. The Native Americans and the old settlers always knew where the high ground was. In an unwelcome echo of Harvey only 2 years later, Southeast Texas experienced another catastrophic flood, courtesy of Tropical Storm Imelda, which made landfall near Freeport in September 2019 and brought heavy rain and dangerous flooding to Southeast Texas. Some areas received over 43 inches with rainfall at 5 inches per hour. Imelda caused extensive flooding on the Lamar University campus and in South Park, and the collapse of a U.S. Postal Service building in Houston. At Lamar, the Cardinal Emergency Fund again assisted students affected by the flood. And it isn't always the weather. As we've seen, sometimes our very blessings themselves are mixed, and we pay a high price for our many natural resources. In the 19th century, cholera and yellow fever periodically swept through our watery, mosquito-ridden region. Horrific accidents in the region's sawmills occurred too frequently. The 1900 Spindletop boom, our major surprise, 1901 Spindletop oil boom, our major surprise gift, saw workers falling from derricks, being scalded in hot slush pits, and being killed in oil field fires. The rapid growth of the refineries, petrochemical plants, and related industries many times outstripped safety plannings. Sadly, those of us who've grown up here have become all too accustomed to periodic refinery fires, explosions, and other industrial accidents. On April 16, 1947, Southeast Texas saw the deadliest industrial disaster in American history and one of history's worst non-nuclear explosions. Mid-morning, a fire ignited in the hold of a French ship docked in the port of Texas City, and the ship exploded, detonating 2,200 tons of ammonium nitrate. The explosion blew the ship's 2-ton anchor. It blew the ship's 2-ton anchor 1.5 miles across town, leveled nearly 1,000 buildings, and set off a chain reaction of fires and explosions in nearby ships and oil storage facilities. Half the windows in Galveston, 10 miles away, were blown out. The disaster killed 581 and injured more than 5,000. Body recovery took more than a month, and some were simply never accounted for. On a personal note, when I was a little kid, I heard the faint rumble of the explosion and felt the ground shake. Later, I heard the adults talking and learned what had happened. All of the nearby towns in Texas and the Gulf Coast sent assistance, and firefighters came from as far away as Los Angeles. Within days, the major companies promised to rebuild. We're nothing if not resilient. Unfortunately, countless other industrial accidents, large and small, have occurred in Southeast Texas through the years. On April 20th, 2010, the Gulf Coast experienced another major oil-related disaster. A well in the Gulf of Mexico being drilled by BP, a British oil and gas company, exploded and began discharging hundreds of millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was the biggest in the history of the petroleum industry and one of the most extensive environmental disasters in American history. It affected beaches from Texas to Florida. Massive efforts at cleanup employed skimmer ships, containment booms, and oil dispersants. Numerous local organizations, volunteer groups, and individuals tackled the contaminated beaches and rescued and cleaned the oil-soaked wildlife. That September, the well was declared sealed off, but reports in 2012 disclosed that it was still leaking. The damage to Gulf plant and animal life has been incalculable, and some species may never recover. The good news is that of the settlement funds paid out by BP, much has gone to coastline restoration projects that have allowed many species to begin the slow trek toward a comeback. The year 2019, last year, saw a whole series of blasts and refinery fires in Southeast Texas. Notably, on November 27th, last Thanksgiving Eve, the Texas Petroleum Chemical Plant in Port Neches exploded in 2 blasts, blowing out windows and knocking out walls of homes and businesses in South Jefferson County and polluting the air with high concentrations of butadiene and benzene. The blasts injured 3, but fortunately no one was killed. Evacuations of much of South Jefferson County caused residents to grab their family recipes and quickly reevaluate Thanksgiving plans in other places. This year, we face the prospect of a double whammy, one, a known enemy, a prediction of an overactive hurricane season, when experts are predicting that the storms will grow stronger. As I speak, we've lately experienced the first of what may be more to come. And as I speak, we face another global pandemic reminiscent of last century's Spanish flu, courtesy of an insidious virus that has frozen the world economy and caused terrible illness and loss of life. We have a brand new set of lessons to learn, but learn them we must and will. It's an eerie time. Those of us who've weathered other Southeast Texas disasters keep reminding ourselves that the pandemic is not, number one, a hurricane, number two, a flood, or number three, an industrial accident, but an unknown quantity. Nobody knows how or when it'll end. Yet again, stories are emerging of businesses, organizations, nonprofits, and individuals who are doing their part to help their neighbors or strangers, often at their own risk. And other bright spots always emerge. Already, many are creatively bringing hope and pleasure through various digital media. But that's quite enough about adversity and disasters. We in this favored spot are extraordinarily blessed, and we often need to remind ourselves of that fact. We've also found that we're resilient, inventive, positive, and always willing to lend assistance wherever and whenever it's needed. However dire the catastrophe and apparently dim the hopes for the future, we always and quickly begin figuring out a way to overcome it. We'll do whatever it takes, and hopefully we'll learn its lessons for the future in whatever form the adversity might take. As then Vice President Lyndon Johnson said on his visit to Southeast Texas after Hurricane Carla, quote, "As always, Texans are arising to challenge. We in Texas are a bold and brave people." And so we are in Southeast Texas, and so hopefully will always be.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. That was fascinating, and as we knew it would be. And during your presentation, you won't be surprised to know a lot of your friends have chimed in and been excited to see you. Maybe the person who dialed in, who checked in from the furthest away, is your friend Dawn from La Jolla, California. But there may be others further than that. But I want to mention to you before we go on to the questions, a lot of people have made comments that were probably best encapsulated by one of our viewers, Christine, and you and I know why I would call her out. But Christine was really excited to hear your point of view on it, because you were probably the most knowledgeable person about the history of Southeast Texas and how we get through these moments. So we appreciate your doing so much research for this presentation.
Juan, I'd like to amend that slightly. My sister is probably she knows the most about Beaumont history of anybody alive.
Well, and I'm doubly fortunate because I get to work with your sister Judy. So that's a great moment. So let's move on and talk a little bit about some of the questions that come in. One of our viewers, Shannon, wanted to know, what was the most interesting thing that you discovered, the most surprising thing that you discovered while you were doing research on resiliency of Southeast Texans?
Gosh, there were so many wonderful moments. It did astound me. I always knew we were resilient, but it did astound me, to discover just how resilient we are and how inventive we are in inventing ways to deal with these things. I can't name one instance really. I just was impressed all over again with our the way we do cope with our particular set of adversities, and I think that's.
And one of our other viewers, Tim, wanted to know who it was that inspired in you such a love of history.
Well, we've talked about that since my sister and I are both in that field, and I think probably it was because we came from a long line of storytellers on both sides of our family. Our father's family, we have huge families on both sides. Our father's family, the Walkers and the Frenches, spun tales to entertain us kids. And it was all about our, forebears. And lots of times our mother used to get a little put out because the stories sometimes verged on the colorful. And then her family, the Hookses and the Seals, both sides spun tales. And, here again, our mother would scold whoever it was if they told one she didn't feel like was particularly suitable to our tender ears. And we grew up, and of course, we have such a strong sense of place because our families have been here for so long. And so we love Southeast Texas, and this is our home. And, I can look out in my backyard and there's my grandfather's pecan tree. And, there are several of the old homes in the area that, belong to our forebears. And so we would hear stories about that. So I think it was a natural thing. And, our father got very interested in history and wrote several things on local history. And I think it just rubbed off on us.
Well, and while you were doing your presentation, I was thinking, especially when you talked about Highway 90 being a high point and how obviously our forebears knew that. And I can attest to that because during Harvey, we evacuated to Highway 90.
Yeah, right.
Other than learning that the people who came before us knew a lot more than we realized they knew, what have you seen in Southeast Texas? What have we learned? What are the changes that we've made after disasters that you think make us better prepared for the next one?
Well, as I said in the talk, every disaster presents its own set of new circumstances. And so we learn new lessons with everything, with each one. And, we learn how better to cope with the floods and the hurricanes. And, we just add to our store of knowledge with each disaster. And of course, with the industrial accidents, the same thing. As I said in the talk, Spindletop caught us all from square one. Nobody ever dreamed that was going to happen. And history literally did change, from one second to the next. And a lot of the safety precautions, there were none in place. And, along with no pipelines, no tank trucks, no tank cars, it was all invented from that time on. And, some of the disasters were truly horrendous. And, after the disasters or during, we learned and we accumulated that body of knowledge. And trouble is, we're always being presented with new disasters. But we do learn. This area does learn. Southeast Texas people are, as I say, we're inventive and we take note for the next one. And sometimes these things repeat enough that we can employ our knowledge and our expertise and accumulated know-how to deal with the next one.
Well, and sort of following up on that, being as how the pandemic is a brand new, different type of disaster for everybody in the world. One of our viewers, Jeff, wondered if there are lessons that, based on your research, lessons that we've learned in resiliency in our community that you think will be specifically important to us as we recover from this one.
Well, we can hark back to the Spanish flu pandemic. And the images, the photographs we have seen of that show nurses with masks. And, it was amazing how familiar that looked. And they did find out, through these different pandemics, that staying away from other people, was the way to chase it off, to diminish it.
And another one of our viewers, Karen, wanted to know if, other than the fascinating story about your feeling the rumbling from the Texas City explosion, which I just find fascinating, do you have other sort of family memories of your family dealing with some of these crises that we've faced over the years?
Well, we, as I said, I didn't evacuate. I went to a friend's house in Koontz during Rita, and one of my friends said, just before we all scattered, she said, "Is Koontz far enough?" And when I ran into her again after the storm, I said, "To answer your question, it wasn't." But, we dealt with it. As I said, I remember the Texas City explosion, just because all of a sudden the ground shook and there was this faint rumble. I thought, what on earth? I mean, never in Southeast Texas had I ever heard of such a thing. Wow. And, with the refinery explosions, we see the flames and the smoke, and, we know what it is. And, and now during the hurricanes, if somebody says evacuate, we do. So, we learn our own ways. And I've been around for a lot of them. I'm betraying my age. Don knows how old I am because he and I were in Lamar together. But, you observe these things and you live through these things, and, you just deal with it from your accumulated experience.
So just following up a little bit on that, what we've noticed, at least during the pandemic now, is the incredible role that our NGOs, our non-governmental organizations who are providing community service, the role that they play is life-saving in this case.
It absolutely is. It's vital. It's just, and I'm so proud every time we have a disaster of whatever kind, they're there. We in Southeast Texas do help each other. And I've heard other people say that who have moved in from other places, that what they don't like the humidity and the mosquitoes, but they say that the community spirit and the desire to help each other is like nowhere else. And I'm really proud of that.
Well, honestly, that's a great note to end on, Ellen. And you will need to go back and watch on our Facebook page this presentation. We've never received so many really dear comments for one of our speakers. You have a lot of friends in our alumni community who are pleased.
That's wonderful. That makes me feel really good. Probably a lot of the kin folks. We still have a lot of kin folks around here. No, seriously, I'm very grateful, and I'm so honored to have been able to do this. And thank you all so much for asking me.
Well, thank you. And you're also very patient. Shannon and I were laughing today that we changed this on you a couple of times, and you're talking about somebody who's flexible, but you are always on, and we appreciate that. We also appreciate everybody at Lamar that's made these things possible. One of our commentators mentioned how good it was, how nice it was to have a sign language interpreter working live during this program, which is a huge effort on behalf of that department on our campus, and we're thrilled that they participated. So we thank everybody. We thank all of you for watching. Ellen and Judy, we thank you both for everything you do for this community and for Lamar and for our community, for our alumni group. And Ellen, thank you again. And we're going to end the program this evening with a piece from our marketing communication department. So thank everybody for being here.
Thank you so much, Juan and Daniel.
In trying times, I'm here for my community.
I will reach my students over any distance.
I'm committed to delivering truth.
Keeping families fed is my purpose. Taking care of people is my passion.
At Lamar University, I was given the skills I need to provide essential services.
no matter where I am.
I'm still here, helping those in need.
And even though we can't always be face to face,
It's because of what I learned at Lamar University that I can be here for you.
Our moment is here.
Our moment is now.
Make the most of it at Lamar University.